Xtalks connects professionals in the life science, medical device, and food industries with useful content like webinars, job openings, articles, and virtual meetings to help you succeed in your career. This food industry-focused podcast brings together some of our editorial staff to share insights into the latest B2B industry news to help keep you up to date. This week on the show, we are discussing the top 5 food and beverage trends of 2022. Enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Xtalks Food Podcast. I'm Sydney Perlmutter, Senior Food Industry Journalist and Webinar Moderator at Xtalks.com, and this week I'm joined by Aish Rashid and Vera Kovacevic. Thank you so much for coming today. So, it is our final podcast of the year. So I'm just going to do a bit of a roundup of the top 5 food and beverage trends of 2022. But first, we can't talk about this year without talking a little bit about the last few years before it. And as we know, the food and beverage industry faced incredible challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially related to delivery, supply chain, and logistics. And many would argue that it's still not quite over yet. Lockdown orders made shopping frustrating and risky, and it was all complicated by social distancing. We had dining restrictions, which forced people to make more meals at home, often with basic staples that were long-lasting and easy to store. Proactive grocery stores turned to e-commerce for online ordering, among many, many other changes that we witnessed. And as the pandemic took hold, food and beverage companies reevaluated their supply chains and business models and invested in new technologies to make themselves more resilient and agile moving forward. Now, over 2 years since the onset of the pandemic, the food and beverage industry has made a remarkable recovery, with innovation picking up where it left off. So at the end of each year, food industry insiders and experts make predictions about the year to come. And last year, of course, was no exception. So we're going to take a look at some of the predictions that were made for 2022 and see whether they panned out, and look back at some of the food and beverage trends that dominated the industry this year. So the first one was plant-based alternatives. So although this trend builds upon growth in previous years, plant-based meat and dairy alternatives continue to be a talking point in the broader food and beverage industry this year. And nearly every 2022 prediction list, from Food Dive to Nielsen and Food Manufacturing, forecasted plant-based foods as a major winner. But did this trend live up to expectations? Despite the fact that more than half of consumers in the US are eating more plant-based foods, and plant-based diets have increased 300% for Americans between 2005 and 2020, plant-based alternatives didn't have the breakthrough year that many experts predicted. This could partially be due to the recovery of the traditional meat industry, the crowded nature of the plant-based alternative space, or a bit of a combination of the two. So this year saw the decline or closure of several different plant-based meat companies. Maple Leaf Foods, whose plant-based alternative brands include Life and Field Roast, reallocated its resources to be consistent with a much smaller growth rate than anticipated. And additionally, meat processing giant JBS shut down its plant-based business, Planterra Foods, only 2 years after it made its retail debut. And prominent plant-based meat players, including Beyond Meat, Gardein, Morningstar Farms, and Quorn, also experienced flat or declining sales in the last few quarters. Recent sales figures have caused concern in some segments of the business, but many believe the sector will bounce back as retailers weed out the poor performers and the valuations of plant-based meat brands drop to more realistic figures. And one key reason why the plant-based alternative space has remained stagnant is due to lack of differentiation among the most prevalent brands, smaller startups, and everything in between. However, I'm sure that plant-based meat and dairy alternatives aren't going anywhere, but the next generation of brands should focus on marketing their products properly rather than repeating the mistakes of their predecessors. So, in looking back at this last year of plant-based alternatives, are you surprised to see that, the growth is kind of stagnant? And for next year, do you think that this trend is going to continue to go downward, or do you see it bouncing back?
Well, I think with inflation and, as you talked before, how the prices of food many different types of food is going up, right? So I think that's why perhaps people are trading the more expensive plant-based meat products for other cheaper alternatives, right? So that could be a reason why plant-based sales are going down. Yeah, to be honest, like we just got out of a pandemic, hopefully for good. And it makes sense that with inflation and everything that's going on that, the plant-based sector may be suffering a bit. But you have mentioned that like the brands didn't really differentiate themselves well. Why did that happen? Or how do they, like, are they all marketing their products in the same way? Is it very monotonic?
Yeah. We did talk about this a few podcasts ago about like the problem with plant-based meat marketing, and they haven't really gone beyond like it's plant-based. And that's really what a lot of them do, right? Rather than choosing a specific ingredient to focus on or the nutritional benefits, really all we get is, there's no meat in this, and it's for vegans and vegetarians. And that was another thing. Like many companies still are just trying to target the vegan and vegetarian eaters rather than the flexitarians and the meat eaters. So you're losing a large portion of the market there when you're really only advertising to to that segment. So there's a lot of flaws right now, but I couldn't tell you why. I think it's little, it's new, right? So they're doing this as for the first time as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I was also surprised to learn that plant-based meat sales were declining so much and so rapidly. I think this happened within the last year. And like Vera said, I think the biggest culprit here is inflation and the looming recession that everyone's talking about. So people are probably watching their wallets and looking at other cheaper alternatives because, plant-based products have been on the market for a while, but like we haven't seen a lot of change in terms of prices going down. They're still expensive compared to other products. And so I think, with like the latest TV or phone coming out, you see in a couple of years that the prices, they start off high, but then they eventually come down. But that hasn't quite happened in the plant-based sector. And that could be for a number of reasons. But I think because they're still sold at a premium, I think that's deterring a lot of consumers away. And all of the other things that we've talked about, like companies not being able to differentiate themselves very well, and companies also not opening up or widening their target audiences. So but surprising nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one thing I wanted to point out is that this phenomenon is so much more prevalent among just plant-based meat rather than dairy alternatives. I think those are still doing very well, and we have we have a lot more established brands in the dairy alternative space, like So Delicious and what's this Silk. As you could tell, I'm a dairy drinker. Silk and oat milk too, Oatly. These brands are still doing pretty well. I think they've just had a little bit
more affordable too, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's also a big factor.
And I think they come with less skepticism as well. I don't think people have an issue or as much of an issue with nut milks and milk alternatives, just because I feel like they've just been around for a lot longer, and a lot of people actually prefer them in terms of like flavor as well, to traditional dairy. And then we also have people with dairy intolerances as well. Yep. So it's an important market. So I don't think those will be going anywhere anytime soon. And maybe we'll see a new nut milk next year. All right, so our second trend of the year is responsible sourcing and traceability. So for many consumers, looking at a food or beverage label isn't enough. They want to know exactly how a product got from the farm to their table. And factory farming is still prevalent, unfortunately, but most people want ethically sourced ingredients, particularly when it comes to meat. And free-range cattle and chickens are most desirable than those who were raised without green pastures and sunlight. Now, motivations are both altruistic and financial that lie behind the movement towards more responsible sourcing. With climate change and global warming only growing in resilience, lowering the industry's collective carbon footprint is of utmost concern. And when it comes to consumers, sourcing responsibly and communicating those efforts with transparency can be a key differentiator. Many consumers, especially younger generations, want to see companies make a concerted effort to source everything as responsibly as possible. Some specific attributes that consumers care about include sustainable packaging, reef safe, including for seafood products, fair trade claim certification, and sustainable farming certification. And in addition, these food and beverage trends also have to align with local and federal regulations. And this year has seen some major changes from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration when it comes to food traceability. So, for example, the FDA this year issued its final rule on requirements for additional traceability records for certain foods, which includes food traceability protocols for a variety of food products susceptible to contamination. So, as consumers of food ourselves, I was wondering if you wanted to know as well, like where exactly your food came from, and would you feel better about it if that was communicated to you, on the package, or do you not really care? And do you see that intrinsically sort of linked with food safety? Would you feel better about it in terms of, the safety of the food?
When you say like where food came from, because at least with like produce or like vegetables or fruits, particularly, like if you buy like a package of blueberries, they're going to say the country that it came from. But do they want like more specific locations? Like, I don't, so for me, when I think of like food traceability, right? Or just responsible sourcing, like there are, in my mind, like two groups of people. There's people who like to buy local, okay, and whatever, if it's at a farmer's market or wherever they get their local foods. Maybe some local foods are like sold in their grocery store nearby, so they prefer to buy local. And then there's people who just don't mind, like it could be the same thing that can be bought local, they'll just buy it internationally or it came from across the country, right? So in my view, when it comes to like food traceability, at least that was the idea that consumers had in the past. But now it's becoming so much more complex because it's like food safety motivations are lying behind that. So like what you mentioned about the FDA, they want their producers to like trace exactly where the food went and where. And I think that kind of information is just going to be obtained by the actual producers and like the people involved in the food supply chain. I don't think we as consumers are going to have access to that information unless we get ill or something. That's my view of it. Like, I don't think we can go into the store and then know, exactly the path that a certain food item took, right? I think that's too complex for to have that kind of visibility up. At least that's what I think about it. Let me know if I'm too off topic, Sydney.
No, I think you're totally right. I think it would be up to the food producer themselves to decide whether they want to provide that information or even whether they're like legally allowed to. You're right. I'm not too sure about that because you're right. This FDA rule is not for consumers to see. It is for food traceability and safety purposes. But I think you're definitely also right about, or at least in my opinion too, I don't necessarily need to know exactly the steps that a carton of blueberries took to get to me, unless I do fall ill and it's because of that. But yeah, I agree with you, Vera.
I think I would kind of like to know, and I'd like to know like why the processes are in many cases so complex. Like, why is there so much complexity behind our food? products. And, it also, and so that ties into the fact that a lot of people may prefer to have more local products. And I think we're going to see a lot of changes in terms of, I was talking to a friend of mine, and just in general trade between countries, with a lot of countries like the US and even Canada trying to bring back domestic production and things like that. So import trade, that's going to probably be changing in the next couple of years. And so it just brings to mind, like, let's say chicken nuggets or something from a certain very popular company, and it's like you find out that like your chicken nugget may have chicken from 3 different countries, sourced from 3 different countries, or a burger that has the beef patty same thing. I learned that the beef may have been sourced from like 3-4 different countries, and it's kind of like, is that necessary, and why, and how? So when you hear about that kind of complexity, it's all about like, undercutting the dollar and just like trying to make, the best profit in the quickest way. And that's not necessarily the best for the consumer, obviously. Right. So in those kinds of cases, like, I think consumers have been putting pressure on food companies to disclose these kinds of details. Now, do we need to know, okay, where it was shipped and the shipping, all of that? Maybe, yes, for food safety, for sure. Contamination can happen along at any step of supply chain and production as well. So, I think more transparency is needed, but to what extent, that's something that we'll have to have a conversation about.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the curiosity behind the steps in the supply chain process also have to do with sustainability, and if you're a sustainable consumer, you want to know like sort of the logistics behind how your food traveled and what sort of transport was used to get it from point A to point B, or the alphabet of steps in between, because you're right, it's often so complex, and that is why a lot of consumers are motivated to shop more locally at farmers markets for things like produce, but then on the other side, it's like that's not always affordable, and we buy what we afford, and sometimes our motivations are just based on finances, and sometimes they're based on other things. So yeah, it's a very like disjointed like consumer base, and it's often based on financials. But you're right, it's extremely complex, and I think like the chicken nugget example is pretty shocking, and it's a very good way to illustrate that we don't know the slightest thing sometimes about where our food is coming from. So going based off of that trend, the next one is sustainable packaging and addressing some food waste. So we're constantly seeing new science and data consistently pointing to an increasing urgency to address the human impact on climate change, and consumers are more aware than ever about how their personal decisions and the brands that they support impact the environment. So as such, food and beverage manufacturers are addressing consumer demands to be more sustainable. So food and beverage trends that are gaining support include shifts away from fossil fuel-based energy sources, reduced water consumption, sustainable packaging, including recyclable, biodegradable, or options that significantly reduce plastic use, and eco-friendly detergent and cleaning solutions for end products and equipment. Packaging that is made of recycled or repurposed materials, for example, is more valuable than single-use items, and plant-based plastics are also becoming more popular because they break down much faster than petroleum-based materials. For example, at the beginning of 2022, a team of scientists from the Harvard T.H. Chan of Public Health and NTU, which is a university in Singapore, unveiled a biodegradable, waterproof, and antibacterial food packaging. Awareness of food waste also continued to grow this year, with best before dates on packaging as a major culprit. While food and beverage manufacturers have used the labels for decades to estimate peak freshness, consumers are confused about date codes, often causing more food waste than necessary. And that's why some grocery stores in the UK are making strides to remove best before dates and instead allow consumers to use their best judgment to determine whether food products are safe to eat. So in terms of, sustainable food packaging, this has obviously been a topic of discussion for many years now. And I think with every passing year, it becomes more important. In the last year, have you seen any changes in the way that certain foods are packaged, or have you become more aware of the foods that you buy, or have you stopped buying a certain food because of the way that it's packaged? For example, I'll throw one out there, and I don't know if I'd ever bought this in the past, but I really can't stand when produce that has a skin of its own is packaged in plastic or something, or even pre-cut or pre-made fruits and vegetables. I think I have put an end to buying just because I know I can do it myself, and there's no point in wasting the plastic there. So that's one example.
Yeah, I would say an example that I've seen this year is, it's not like directly related, but shopping bags in grocery stores.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. It's
phasing those out. Like at Walmart, they don't have plastic bags anymore. So you have like the cloth bags that you can buy. And at first it was kind of like, first world problems. You might forget them in your car, blah, blah, blah. But now it's just becomes like second nature habit. Oh, got to grab the bags. And it's amazing. It's wonderful. And I really, appreciate these kinds of changes coming. So that's a big change that I've noticed this year in terms of heading towards greater sustainability in the food sector. And I think it's great. And it's just a matter of habit. Bad habits die hard, but they will eventually die. So, and it's been a good shift too. So that's one example that definitely comes to mind this year.
For me, like what I've started to do is if I can buy that juice or that pop or whatever drink I want to drink, if I can buy it in a bigger packaging instead of buying several units of that drink in a small packaging, I will do that. Even if it is heavier to lug around and carry, I will still do that because, it minimizes like the waste that's contributed, right? I myself haven't really noticed a difference in how the food is packaged at the grocery store. Like it still looks the same to me. But that's one thing I've started doing just because I've seen a video of like how much plastic pollution there is in the ocean. And that really scared me. And I'm really trying to minimize like how much plastic bottles I buy.
Yeah, I think one thing we're getting back to is now that pandemic restrictions have sort of eased and we're not as concerned about like, health risks as we once were. I think we're seeing a bit of a return of like bring your own coffee mugs to places like Starbucks, and that's a huge one. I mean, Starbucks and not to single them out, but many quick service and fast food restaurants are very wasteful in terms of plastic and cups in particular. So I think we may see more of that coming back next year, and even a rise of like no waste grocery stores. I know they're very small and niche at this point, but I love the idea of bringing your own containers or glass or whatever to buy bulk foods and things like that. And I hope that we start seeing more of those in the future because it's such a fantastic idea. Now, I'm only going to talk about one more since we're running out of time. So I'll talk about lab-grown meat and more. So this year witnessed a watershed moment for the lab-grown meat space with the FDA approving Upside Foods lab-grown chicken. The lab-grown meat was approved through the FDA's generally recognized as safe process, or GRAS, in which the FDA reviews a food company's production process and final product and gives it a no further questions letter if it's deemed safe to consume. And while Upside Foods awaits approval from the U.S. Department of Agriculture before it can be commercialized, some 100 startups around the world have been working to get lab-grown meat out of the lab and into small production facilities. And one such company is called Stakeholder Foods, which is an Israeli food startup that offers 3D printed cultured pork, chicken, fish, and seafood. But cultured meat wasn't the only food to come out of the lab this year. Cell-based chocolate was also at the forefront of the lab-grown food space in 2022. This is made by growing cells in a similar way to cultured meat and seafood. Cell-based chocolate, it circumvents the need for illegal forest clearing linked to cocoa production and the human rights issues that come along with it. And perhaps the most well-known company in the cell-based chocolate space is California Cultured, but others are working on their own novel technologies as well. And like chocolate, coffee has also got a lab-made makeover this year to combat rising temperatures, climate changes, and increasing pests that negatively impact coffee yields. Compound Foods, along with other lab-made coffee startups, created coffee that boasts the same flavor, caffeine content, and aromas as regular coffee, but without the negative environmental impacts. So I think this year, above any year, was definitely the biggest for the lab-grown space. And I also wanted to highlight that it wasn't just lab-grown meat, that it was also, we're seeing cell-based chocolate and coffee, lab-grown coffee as well. Is this something, and we've talked about this on past podcasts before, but are you excited to see where this goes? And do you think that we might be seeing new foods that can be grown in a lab in the future?
Yeah, definitely excited to see where this goes. Though I do think that lab-grown coffee and lab-grown chocolate are probably going to be, on shelves sooner than lab-grown meat, just because lab-grown meat just seems so complex, right? The second something is animal-based, it's just more complex than something plant-based to grow in a lab. But yeah, I am excited for this. I think it's definitely going to be its own niche market, kind of like plant-based meat. But I think it will take some time. I honestly think like 5 years or more.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Vera that I think it's still in its early stages, but definitely very exciting, and especially exciting that it went through an FDA approval process, because I think that definitely lends a vote of confidence among people who may have been skeptical of something grown in a lab and what is it about. But the fact that you have a regulatory body that's approved a product that is lab grown, and I think that really makes it more realistic and tangible on one hand, and also lends confidence as well. So I think this was a huge step in that direction towards lab grown food products. And yeah, growing meat in a lab is likely to be more complex, than other plant-based products, but who knows, growing coffee doesn't sound so easy either in a lab. So but yeah, really cool stuff in food tech that we always hear from you, Sydney, on the podcast. So looking forward to more in the coming year.
All right, well, that's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Food Podcast. If you like today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thanks, everyone, and see you next year. Bye.
Yes, bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Xtalks Food Industry Podcast. If you enjoyed our discussions today, please share the episode with your friends and colleagues, and be sure to subscribe in order to be notified when a new episode is released. To join in on the discussion, you can find Xtalks on social media, email podcast@xtalks.com, or comment on the articles directly. Links are in the show description. Take a moment to join our community at xtalks.com to get access to everything we have to offer, including webinars, job listings, virtual meetings, articles, and more. The views and opinions expressed in the podcast are those of the speakers sharing them. They should not be taken as professional advice and do not necessarily reflect the policy or position Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.